I basted the turkey for the third time, listening to laughter spill from the living room, distant, muffled, like I was hearing it through a wall. I looked around the kitchen and realized no one had come in to check on me. Not once. Not to ask if I needed help. Not to thank me. Not even to offer me a glass of water. My hands ached from chopping, my back tight from standing. But what stayed with me most wasn't the pain. It was the sound of a camera shutter snapping in the next room, followed by another round of laughter. That was when I knew the picture had been taken without me. No one called for me. No one noticed I wasn't in it. I'm Helen Morton, 70 years old, and that was the moment I knew I had become invisible in the very home I once paid for. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. I stood there for a while, still holding the basting brush, trying to remember the last time they had asked what I wanted for Christmas. Not a gift, I stopped expecting those years ago. I meant something simpler, a chair at the table, a slice of pie already plated, someone saving me a seat in the photo. Instead, they saved space for each other, their partners, their children, the new dog, even the boyfriend of my eldest granddaughter who had only joined the family last month. I stayed in the kitchen, wiping counters, stirring gravy, folding napkins no one unfolded. They let me work while they played. I had been up since 5:30 a.m., quietly peeling potatoes in the half-dark while the house slept. I had trimmed the green beans, set the table, placed little paper tags with names, a tradition I had kept for 34 years. My name tag was there too. Neatly written. Placed at the far end. But when dinner was finally ready and I called everyone to sit, they kept talking. Kept scrolling through their phones, passing the camera around to see who looked best. They sat slowly, distracted, commenting on the food with polite nods, but not one person looked at me like I had made it with love. Just assumption. Like it was owed. Like the food had simply appeared, like I had simply always been there. Afterward, they left the table. Plates half full. Laughter bouncing down the hall toward the living room where the fireplace glowed. I heard wrapping paper rustle again. More pictures. Someone had brought matching pajamas. I stayed back to wash dishes. Not once did anyone say, "Come sit with us." Not once did someone ask, "Do you want to be in this one?" I leaned against the counter, holding a damp dish towel, and looked at the doorway. I half expected someone, anyone, to peek in and say, "Mom, where are you?" But no one did. And so I dried the dishes. I packed the leftovers. I wiped down the table. I stacked their plates like I had for decades. And I did it all while they posed in front of the tree. That night, in the quiet of my bedroom, the same bedroom I once shared with their father before he passed, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the family portrait someone had left on the side table. 12 people smiling. One person missing. Me. They didn't crop me out. They simply never turned to look for me. And I realized something then. Something I should have seen sooner. They didn't think I needed to be seen. Because I had made it easy not to see me. I had fed, supported, comforted, and carried them. I had paid the mortgage, co-signed student loans, made holiday plans, learned everyone's favorite dessert, and quietly forgave every missed birthday call. I had been so reliable, so seamless, that they stopped noticing I was there at all. They didn't thank me because they didn't see me. And they didn't see me because I had always made myself the background. That was the last Christmas I hosted. The last meal I prepared without being asked how I was doing. The last time I made room for people who never thought to make room for me. I took down the stockings one by one, folded the red tablecloth, and tucked it away. Not for next year. Just away. Somewhere between the kitchen and the cold bedroom, something inside me clicked into place, not rage, not sorrow. Just clarity. This was no longer my home. It was a house they lived in. And the deed? Well, the deed still had my name on it. There's a certain kind of giving that never shows up in photos. The kind you can't gift wrap or post online. The kind that gets folded into routines, so ordinary, so steady, that no one thinks to say thank you. That's the kind of mother I was. I was 22 when I married their father. 25 when I had my first son. I used to rock him at midnight with one hand while folding laundry with the other. Back then, we lived in a one-bedroom rental with thin walls and a leaky faucet that kept us up at night. Still, I made it home. I hung curtains I sewed myself, turned old jars into vases, made meals from scratch when the fridge was nearly bare. I remember holding his tiny feet in my hands and thinking, I'll give you everything I never had. And I did. I went without dental work for 6 years so they could have braces. I didn't buy new shoes more than once a year. I reused wrapping paper, clipped coupons, drove the same car for 17 winters. I learned how to fix a leaking toilet just so we wouldn't have to call someone. I learned how to stretch $1 until it looked like something more. Every field trip permission slip came back signed on time. Every birthday was remembered, even when money was tight. I always remembered their teachers' names. Always showed up for parent-teacher nights with a folder full of notes. I cheered at every school performance, whether they stood center stage or forgot their lines. And when they failed, when they cried, when they came home feeling small, I never said, I told you so. I said, try again. When their father died, I held the house together with both hands. They were grown by then, more or less, but they still needed something to orbit around. That something was me. I kept the Christmas lights going even when my heart wasn't in it. I still made his favorite pie, still put out his stocking, not because I thought he would come back, but because they needed to feel like nothing had changed. I remember one year, my eldest lost her job just before Thanksgiving. She didn't tell anyone else. Just me. She showed up on my doorstep crying, and I gave her my credit card to get through December. She said she'd pay me back. She never did. I never asked. Another time, my son forgot their anniversary, completely blanked. His wife was furious. I drove to the store, bought flowers and a card, signed his name, and left them on her porch while they were still fighting in the living room. She thought he remembered. He let her. I let him. Because that's what mothers do, don't they? We carry their guilt. Their forgetfulness. Their blind spots. We smooth the edges of their lives so they can believe they're whole. I didn't mind it then. I thought it was love. And maybe it was. But looking back now, I see how quickly it became expectation. They never stopped to ask if I needed help. Never thought to ask how much I had sacrificed to make their lives feel easy. They called when something broke, their car, their heart, their plans, and I always answered. Even when I was tired. Even when I was sick. Even when I had to prop the phone up on a pillow because my hands were too arthritic to hold it steady. They called me when they needed to feel cared for. But they never called just to say they cared. I remember one night, I had a fall. Just in the kitchen. Slipped on some water near the sink. I sat on the floor for a long time before I could move again. I didn't call anyone. I didn't want to bother them. I told myself it wasn't serious. But I think, deep down, I just knew they wouldn't come. That's when I started writing things down. Not in anger, just to remember. I made lists. Not grocery ones. Not chores. But lists like times I showed up unasked. Times I gave money I didn't have. Times I swallowed my sadness to protect theirs. It got long. Longer than I expected. I stopped writing only because I realized something: no one else was keeping track. No one else even remembered. What had been sacrifice for me had been seamless for them. They had never seen the toll it took because I had never shown it. And that's my fault, too. I raised them to believe I didn't have limits. That I would always be there, with soup, with advice, with money in an envelope, with arms open. And for years, I was. But over time, what had once been gratitude turned into habit. They no longer said thank you. They just handed me more. Until one Christmas, I cooked dinner alone. And they took a photo without me. You don't notice them at first, the little moments where love starts to thin out. The gestures that once felt full but begin to feel routine. The calls that come less often. The texts that don't get answered. It all begins so quietly, you almost convince yourself nothing's changing. But it is. I remember the first time I realized they were leaving me behind. It wasn't dramatic. Just a Tuesday. I had baked cookies, oatmeal raisin, my grandson's favorite, and walked them over after school. They weren't home. I hadn't called ahead, just assumed. I left the container on the porch. Later, I saw them post photos from a museum trip. I waited for a thank you. It never came. The container showed up in a box 3 months later, unwashed. Little things like that started piling up. They'd plan trips and tell me afterward. It was a last-minute getaway. Just the 4 of us this time. Next time, maybe. I'd smile and nod and say, of course. But every time, a little piece of me sank. Because I remembered every trip I helped make possible, the bags I packed for them as kids, the passports I held on to, the sunscreen I never forgot. Once, I offered to take the kids to the zoo. It had been a while since I spent time with them. I thought it might give their parents a break. My son smiled, then said, "Let me check with her." He didn't call back. A week later, I saw pictures online of them at the zoo. Matching t-shirts. Cotton candy smiles. It would have hurt less if they had just said no. But instead, they made space for me to hope, and then stepped around me. There was a birthday dinner I wasn't invited to. I found out because the restaurant tagged one of them in a photo, all of them around a table, laughing, cake lit, faces flushed with wine. I had called that morning to wish her a happy birthday. She said she wasn't doing anything big. She said, just a quiet night in. Quiet for who? There was also the time my heater broke. January. A bitter cold snap had settled in. I bundled under blankets and boiled pots of water just to warm the air. I didn't tell them. Not because I wanted to test them, but because, deep down, I knew what the answer would be. Or worse, that there wouldn't be one. And I was tired of that silence. And then, of course, there were the holidays. I was given the wrong time for Thanksgiving dinner. Showed up just as they were finishing dessert. Someone said, "We thought you weren't coming." I sat at the edge of the table with a cup of cold cider, listening to them talk over me, around me. I left early. No one followed. After that, I stopped bringing pies. Stopped double-checking the head count. Stopped asking what they needed. Because I finally understood they didn't want me involved, they wanted me nearby. Like a keepsake. Or an old photograph. Nice to have. But not necessary. I still have the voicemail from the night my grandson was born. It's only 20 seconds long. My son sounds tired. Happy. He says, he's here. I replayed that message hundreds of times. I wasn't at the hospital. They hadn't called until it was over. I dropped off a gift the next day, a hand-knit blanket I'd made in the evenings when I couldn't sleep. No one mentioned it. I never saw it again. Eventually, I stopped knitting for them. Not out of bitterness, just because I finally knew they weren't cold. 100 quiet hurts. None of them dramatic. But each one carved a small hollow space in me. One I tried to fill with logic, with excuses, with soft understanding. I told myself they were busy. That I was asking too much. That maybe it was normal, this slow fading. But mothers know when the light begins to dim. And the hardest part? They never asked how I was. Not once. Not when I had surgery on my hand. Not when I slipped on the front steps and bruised my hip. Not when the anniversary of their father's death passed quietly, a day they forgot while I set his photo out with a candle. I started keeping a list. Not a bitter one. Just to remind myself it wasn't all in my head. I wrote down the missed calls, the one-word texts, the forgotten invitations, the moments when I swallowed my sadness because saying it out loud felt like asking for crumbs. I filled a whole notebook before I stopped. And when I read it back, I didn't cry. I just sat very still. Because I had never seen it all together before. How they had stepped around me, over me, beyond me, and how I had made it easy. I had always made things easy. And in doing so, I had taught them how to live without considering me at all. It arrived folded in a cheerful holiday envelope. The kind printed with snowmen and glittered snowflakes, the kind you find in packs of 12 for $2.99 at the pharmacy. I opened it with a soft smile, expecting a card. A gesture. Maybe even a late thank you for Christmas dinner. Inside was a letter. Typed. Formal. Addressed to me. It took a moment to register what it was. My son and his wife had drawn up a plan. A transfer of interest agreement. They wanted to refinance the house. Remove my name from the deed. Make it cleaner, the letter said. For the bank. For insurance. For legal clarity going forward. They included a copy of the form. A line for my signature. A prepaid envelope. No phone call. No conversation. Just paper. I remember reading it 3 times before setting it down. They had wrapped betrayal in paperwork. Dressed it up in language that sounded professional, detached even. As if the home I had built, the walls I had painted, the mortgage I had helped carry, could be reduced to an administrative inconvenience. They called it a simplification. I called it what it was, erasure. That house had been mine first. Bought in 1991, after 3 years of saving every extra dollar. I picked it because of the front porch, wide and west-facing, perfect for sunsets. It had needed work. I refinished the floors by hand. Regrouted the bathroom tile. My husband and I raised 2 kids under that roof, celebrated every Christmas in that kitchen. When my husband passed, and they needed help buying it, I hadn't hesitated. I signed my name beside theirs. I let them move in. I moved into the smaller guest room without complaint. And when they said they were grateful to share a home across generations, I believed them. But now? They wanted me gone, not just physically, but formally. Officially. My name, my claim, my memory. All of it, wiped clean with a signature. I didn't call them. I didn't yell. I didn't even cry. Instead, I walked to the drawer beside my bed and took out the original deed. The one from 32 years ago. My name printed clearly at the top. I ran my fingers across the ink and reminded myself, you were here first. You made this place what it is. I placed the new letter beside it. The contrast was almost laughable. Then I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out the window. The backyard still held the swing set we built when the kids were 6 and 8. The ropes were worn now, the seat faded from sun. But I remembered the laughter. The scraped knees. The stories they told while swaying gently back and forth. They had no idea what it had cost me to keep that yard, through layoffs, through grief, through lonely winters. They always assumed the house would one day be theirs. And part of me, long ago, wanted that too. But there's something about being asked to disappear that makes you reconsider what's fair. I waited a week before responding. I spoke with a lawyer first, a woman named Judith, my age, sharp and steady. I brought everything, the deed, the letter, the financial statements. She read in silence, then looked at me and said, "You're under no obligation. You still hold interest. They can't force you out." I nodded. She asked what I wanted to do. And for the first time in a long time, I answered without hesitation. "I want to remind them whose name built this." I didn't send back the signed form. I didn't explain. I didn't argue. Instead, I drafted my own letter, short, clear, polite. "I am choosing not to relinquish my name from the deed. This home carries decades of my investment, labor, and memory. I will remain a legal co-owner unless circumstances change." I printed it on good paper. Folded it neatly. Slipped it into a plain envelope. No snowmen. No glitter. Just my name, in full, across the top corner. I mailed it without ceremony. They received it 2 days later. I know because I got a call. It went to voicemail. My son's voice, tight, slightly raised. "Mom, we just thought this would make things easier. We didn't mean anything by it." Easier for who? I didn't call back. Instead, I sat on that west-facing porch and watched the sun drop behind the roofline. The light stretched long and golden across the boards. The wind picked up just enough to move the old swing back and forth. They wanted the house without the history. But I was the history. And I wasn't done being remembered. I didn't slam any doors. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't raise my voice or demand apologies. That's never been my way. My mother used to say, "Dignity isn't something you shout about, it's something you carry." And I carried it, even when it felt like a weight I couldn't lift. After I mailed the letter, I turned inward. I didn't bring it up again, not during meals, not in passing. I let them speak about mortgage rates and renovation plans and future extensions as if they hadn't tried to push me out of it all. I nodded when necessary. Smiled softly. Said we'll see more often than I used to. But something in me had shifted. Silence became my sanctuary. It wasn't passive. It was active, deliberate. A choice. When they left for weekend trips without telling me, I stopped asking where they'd gone. When they brought home takeout and didn't offer me a plate, I stopped pretending I wasn't hungry. I'd boil myself a small pot of soup and eat it in my room, a book open beside me, the quiet filling every corner. It's strange how silence changes a room. It makes your presence feel heavier. More noticeable. And yet, it also becomes a kind of shield. They didn't know what I was thinking. And they didn't ask. I started writing again. Not stories. Just small notes. Observations. Feelings I couldn't say out loud. I kept them in a leather-bound journal, a gift from my late husband, never used until then. Each morning, after they left for work or errands or school drop-offs, I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea and write down what I had noticed. The way my daughter-in-law had started referring to the house as their place. The fact that my name was left off the return address on Christmas cards. How the guest towels I had folded had been replaced with newer ones. Mine tossed somewhere in the laundry room. These were small things. But when you're being erased, it never happens in one clean sweep. It happens in small edits. I also began reviewing documents, old papers I hadn't touched in years. Bank records, insurance forms, property tax receipts. I made copies. I created folders. I researched what it would mean to reassert my financial rights. I didn't know what I would do with all of it yet. But I knew I needed to understand what had been taken, and what could still be claimed. That fall, I met with Judith again. We sat across from each other in her small, tidy office above the florist shop. She remembered everything, the deed, the letter, the names. "What do you want?" she asked again. This time, I was clearer. "I want to know that when I die, they can't rewrite who I was." She understood. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. so I updated my will. Reworded some clauses. Named specific bequests, right down to the silver tea set my mother had given me and the cedar chest from my wedding day. I made sure the house couldn't be transferred without my signature. I arranged for a small trust to be set up for my granddaughter, a quiet act of faith that not everyone would grow up blind to gratitude. I made choices I didn't tell anyone about. I held my silence like a steady breath. One evening, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. They thought I was asleep. My daughter-in-law's voice, sharp but low, she's just always there. I need more space. Then my son, hesitant, maybe she'll go stay with Aunt Elaine for a while. I didn't move. Didn't flinch. I just listened. And later, when the house was dark, I stood in the hallway and stared at the wall of family photos. My face in frame after frame, but always at the edge. Always one step outside the moment. So I took a few down. Not all of them. Just enough to feel the weight shift. I boxed them quietly and placed them under my bed. That's when I started setting money aside. Not from them, I wasn't taking anything. Just my own small savings. I canceled a few subscriptions. Stopped gifting as generously. I opened a separate account under my full name. I called it the Porch Light Fund. A little joke to myself. For the day I'd leave this house and take the light with me. Because that's what I had been. The one who kept things warm, visible, held together. And now, I was preparing to go dark. I didn't announce it. I didn't hint at it. But I moved differently. I stopped reminding them about anniversaries. I stopped watching the children when they ran late. I stopped folding their laundry when it sat clean in the basket for days. I stopped filling the fridge with their favorites. I stopped waiting to be seen. And the quieter I became, the more clearly I heard my own voice again. It had been there all along. Just buried under years of noise that wasn't mine. There comes a moment when you realize you've stayed too long in a place that no longer sees you. For me, it wasn't one dramatic event, not a door slammed or a suitcase packed. It was more like watching wallpaper peel. Slow, quiet, undeniable. One Sunday morning in early spring, I went to the farmer's market by myself. I used to love going with my husband. We'd walk hand in hand, take our time, ask the growers about their beans and tomatoes like they were precious antiques. That morning, I bought tulips. Yellow ones. I walked past a booth selling handmade wooden signs and stopped when one caught my eye. It said, "Start where you are. Use what you have. Do what you can." I bought it without thinking. It cost $12. I paid in cash. That night, I hung it above my mirror. It was the first thing I saw every morning for the next 6 months. And each time I read it, I did something small. I visited 3 retirement communities quietly, under the guise of helping a friend. One was too cold and too new. One smelled of lemon cleaner and felt like a waiting room. But the third, Oak Hollow, had a courtyard filled with lavender and a library with worn armchairs. I sat in one and stayed for an hour. No one rushed me. No one spoke over me. I put my name down for an open studio apartment facing the East Garden. 2 weeks later, I was approved. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I was hiding, but because I didn't owe an explanation. That summer, I sold some of my jewelry. The ones no one asked about. The bracelets and brooches that lived in velvet boxes untouched for years. I kept one ring, a small sapphire one my husband gave me on our 10th anniversary, and wore it on my right hand. Not as a memory, but as a claim. In August, I opened a safe deposit box. I placed the deed copy there. My will. The updated power of attorney forms. All of it, labeled and legal. I began packing slowly. A few books here. A few clothes there. My things had already been pushed aside so many times, they were easy to gather. I used plain boxes and kept them in my closet. No one noticed. I told Judith, my lawyer, about the move. She smiled. "You've done this with grace," she said. "That's the rarest kind of strength." The day I signed the lease at Oak Hollow, I walked through my new place with a key in hand and the light from the east windows spilling across the wooden floor. It smelled like fresh paint and possibility. The manager handed me a welcome basket, a mug, a soft throw blanket, a tin of tea. I sat down on the edge of the bed and felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief. Not quite joy. But something close to breath. Back at the old house, things had become colder. Not in temperature, but in spirit. The conversations shorter. The gratitude thinner. Even the children had started forgetting I was there, as if I'd become another piece of furniture. On the last Sunday of September, I cooked breakfast. Just for me. Eggs, toast, and one ripe peach. Then I wrote a note. Not an explanation, not a plea. Just, I've found a place that feels more like home now. I've left my contact information below. Please don't worry. I'm safe, I'm well. And I wish you peace. I left the house before they came downstairs. I left the porch light off. I moved into Oak Hollow on a Monday. The sky was clouded but soft, the air cool enough for a sweater. My neighbor, a widow named Clara with silver hair and kind eyes, brought me a vase for my tulips. The first night, I sat on the little balcony and drank tea. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. I didn't look at my phone. I didn't wonder who was calling. I didn't brace for guilt. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was rebuilding. In October, I joined the book club. I started walking every morning with two women who liked to count birds and name trees. I helped in the community garden, mostly herbs and a few rows of lettuce. I signed up for a watercolor class, even though I hadn't held a paintbrush since 1982. Every week, I put a little money into savings. Every night, I wrote in my journal. Not about them, not anymore. But about me. What I liked. What I remembered. What I hoped for. I'd spent so many years orbiting other people's needs that I had forgotten what it meant to have my own gravity. Now I was pulling myself back in. One small act at a time. It took them a while to notice I was gone. Not physically, that they figured out soon enough. My note sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before someone moved it. But the depth of my absence? That unfolded slowly, like fog lifting over water. At first, I imagined they told themselves it was temporary. That I was being dramatic. That I'd come back once I cooled off. My son had always believed silence was just a pause before surrender. He didn't understand that this silence was permanent, not punishment, but release. I didn't leave with rage. I left with precision. And when I stepped away, the cracks they'd plastered over with my presence began to show. I had been the invisible glue. The one who remembered birthdays, restocked the pantry staples, folded the laundry no one asked about, picked up the shoes from the hallway so no one tripped. None of it heroic. All of it habitual. That's what made it powerful. My routines were their safety net. Without me, there were gaps. Not just in schedules, but in spirit. At Oak Hollow, I settled into my new rhythm. The world outside my window bloomed into oranges and golds. I started baking again, just for myself. A single apple tart. A half-dozen scones. It was strange how satisfying it felt to cook without measuring someone else's preferences. Clara, my neighbor, often joined me in the afternoons. We sat on the balcony with tea, watching squirrels dance across the railings. One day, she brought over an old radio, and we listened to Ella Fitzgerald as the sun dipped low. It was peace, not the kind you earn, but the kind you finally allow. Then, one morning, I received a voicemail from my granddaughter. Her voice was small. She asked where I'd gone. Said her mother wouldn't tell her. That no one had answered her questions at dinner. I sat with that message for hours. I didn't call back. But I wrote her a letter. I told her that I loved her deeply. That I missed her laughter. That I hoped she was reading books and dreaming big. I told her that sometimes, grown-ups make choices they don't understand. But that love doesn't disappear, it just finds quieter places to live. I mailed it the next day. No return address. Just my initials. After that, things began to shift. I received a call from my son. I didn't answer. A week later, another, followed by a message. We should talk. That's all he said. But we had talked. For years, we had spoken across the chasm. And still, I had been unseen. Now, in my absence, he was discovering how loud a quiet woman can be. The house, I heard, grew tense. My routines had covered for more than just chores. They had kept the peace. When the dishwasher wasn't emptied and the milk ran out, it wasn't a crisis. But when the tension between a tired father and a frustrated wife boiled over, my absence became unmistakable. I had been the buffer. The one who smoothed sharp edges. Who made things feel manageable. And when buffers disappear, everything collides. I ran into an old neighbor at the grocer one Thursday. She looked surprised to see me. Lighter, she said. Freer. I smiled. I was. She told me my son looked tired lately. That the kids missed me. That the youngest had asked if I was coming for Thanksgiving. I thanked her. And said nothing more. I knew better than to return to a table that only needed me to serve. Instead, I made my own plans. Thanksgiving morning, I baked a small roast chicken. I made stuffing with mushrooms and walnuts, just the way I liked it. I drank a glass of white wine and listened to Nina Simone. Later that day, Clara and 2 others from Oak Hollow joined me for dessert. We laughed over pumpkin pie. Shared stories of past holidays. No one raised their voice. No one was missing. The next week, my son showed up at the Oak Hollow reception desk. He hadn't called. Just appeared. I wasn't home. Clara left me a note. He looked lost. I didn't tell him your room number. I never asked her to protect me. But she did anyway. And that's the thing, kindness from strangers fills a different ache. It asks nothing of your history. It doesn't hold your mistakes against you. It simply sees who you are now. By Christmas, I received no card from them. That was fine. I wrapped gifts for the ladies in watercolor class. I baked gingerbread for the front desk staff. I wrote myself a letter and tucked it under the tree. It said, "You kept your promise. You kept your peace." What they lost without me wasn't a maid, or a sitter, or a cook. It was the heart of the home they tried to claim without cost. And you can't replace that with noise, or apps, or new countertops. Some things, once removed, leave a silence that echoes. I was no longer there to soften life for them. But I had softened life for myself. And that, I decided, was enough. It had been a long time since I sat with paper and pen and wrote without needing to explain myself. Most of my life had been spent drafting shopping lists, birthday cards, and reminders for others to buy milk, to take their medication, to pick up the dry cleaning. Words were tools. Service. Never release. But in the quiet of Oak Hollow, during one gray morning in February, I sat down at my small writing desk, the one with the chipped corner and soft pine scent, and I opened a new notebook. Not to write to them. But to write to her. To me. The woman I had been. The girl I used to be. The version of myself that once bent so easily, I mistook it for strength. I didn't start with "Dear." That felt too formal. Instead, I wrote, "You don't have to smile when you're breaking. You don't have to offer the bigger slice, the warmer coat, the only chair. You don't have to be grateful just because they didn't yell." The words came slower after that. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I had so much to feel through before I could put anything down. I told her how long I had carried everyone else's needs like groceries with handles that cut into my fingers. How often I apologized without reason, simply to keep peace. How easily I disappeared behind other people's spotlight, believing that invisibility was humility. I told her about the first time my son pushed my hand away in the grocery store when he was 10. It was small. But I remember the sting. How I laughed it off. How I never took his hand again. I wrote about the time I spent 4 days sewing a Halloween costume for my granddaughter, only for her to say she wanted a store-bought one instead. No thank you. No glance back. And still, I had smiled. I wrote about Christmas. The last one. The smell of rosemary and cloves in the air. The roast, carved and ready. My seat, left empty in every photo. That part, I crossed out and rewrote 3 times. It hurt. Even in memory. But I let it stay. Then I told her this: "You did not imagine it. You did not overreact. You did not expect too much. You expected decency. And when it didn't come, you stayed anyway, for years. That's not weakness. That's devotion. But now, you choose yourself. And that's not selfish. That's survival." I stopped writing when my hand began to ache. I looked out at the courtyard, bare branches twisting like veins across the pale sky. A single bird flitted from one tree to the next, a flash of movement in the stillness. I folded the letter and placed it in the bottom drawer of my nightstand. No envelope. No date. Just paper. Later that week, I wrote another, this time to my husband. I hadn't spoken to him out loud in years. He was buried in a simple plot on the north side of the cemetery, beneath a cherry tree. The headstone was modest. His name, the dates, and a phrase I had chosen, he lived with quiet conviction. He had. But his silence wasn't always a gift. In the letter, I wrote, "You were a good man. But you made me small, even without knowing. You let them shape me into background. You called it peace. I called it erosion." I thanked him for the good. The laughter, the steady income, the Sundays he made pancakes. But I told him, gently, that I was learning to live without needing anyone's shadow to soften the sun. That letter, I burned. I took it to the community fire pit behind Oak Hollow, on a night when the sky was the color of stone and the wind carried the scent of pine. I watched the paper curl and turn black. I watched my handwriting flicker, then vanish. And in that moment, I felt something settle in me, like dust on an old shelf that no longer needed dusting. Freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a woman standing alone in the dark, her face warm from flame, her past folding into smoke. That spring, I stopped waiting for calls. I stopped wondering if they had learned their lesson, or felt guilty. I stopped framing my healing as a reaction to their pain. I started calling myself whole. Not despite them. But entirely outside of them. And in that space, a life began to grow. One stitched not from apology, but from truth. One planted not in their house, but in mine. Most mornings begin the same way now. I wake up just as the light brushes the edge of the curtains. That pale, silver light that only comes in early spring. I no longer set alarms. I no longer answer to anyone's schedule but my own. There's something deeply kind about a morning that expects nothing of you. I make coffee in silence. No television, no phone. Just the gentle drip of the pot and the sound of wind brushing the windows. Sometimes, I sit at the small kitchen table and write a single sentence in my journal. Not always profound. Sometimes it's just, the air smelled like lilac today. But I write it anyway. Because it's mine. The deed is in my drawer now. Not framed. Not displayed. Just resting between two old bank envelopes and the key to a jewelry box I no longer use. The house is no longer theirs to claim. It is no longer the battleground for silence and smiling insults. It is mine. And yet, I don't cling to it like proof. It isn't a trophy. It's a shift, a small turning of power back into my hands. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed to feel the ground beneath my own name again. I don't see them often. A few birthdays have passed without cards. Easter came and went without the usual tray of deviled eggs or someone asking me to bring the old potato salad. The absence of those things used to hurt. Now, it's just quiet. And in that quiet, I've learned how to listen differently. I walk most afternoons. Sometimes with Clara. Sometimes alone. There's a trail behind Oak Hollow that runs through a grove of birch trees. The bark peels like old paper, and the ground is always soft. I walk it slowly, not because I can't move fast, but because I choose not to. There's no urgency here. No one tapping a foot, checking a clock, or asking what's for dinner. I watch the world now in details, the way light hits puddles, the curve of a sparrow's wing, the way wind carries scent and memory alike. I no longer rush to prove I am useful. I no longer fear being called selfish. I water my plants. I reread favorite books. I've started knitting again, nothing grand, just scarves with uneven edges and soft yarns that feel like comfort in my hands. Some days, I hear laughter in the courtyard. It reminds me of long ago. My son's giggle when he was 6. My husband's rare belly laugh over an old radio show. These sounds don't haunt me anymore. They sit beside me like photographs. Familiar. Faded. Still part of me, but no longer pulling me under. People ask if I'm lonely. I tell them, honestly, no. Loneliness is the ache of being unseen. But I see myself now. And that has made all the difference. There's a woman in the poetry group here who told me once that healing isn't a mountain you climb, it's a field you lie down in, after years of marching. You just lie down, and let the sun undo what the storm left behind. I understood her completely. The old me. The one who filled every silence with casseroles and apologies, she's still here, in some ways. But she's quieter now. She knows her worth doesn't depend on being needed. A week ago, my granddaughter sent me a letter. A real one, with pen and stamps and everything. She said she missed my stories. Asked if I still had the recipe for those cinnamon cookies. Said things felt different at home. Quieter. Less warm. I sat with that letter for hours. And then I replied. I sent her the recipe. Nothing more. Not to be cold, but to be clear. I'm not rebuilding burnt bridges. But I will send light through the cracks. My life is quiet now. Not the silence of being ignored. The silence of choosing peace. And when I sit with that, with the hum of a slow evening, a half-knitted scarf in my lap, and no one asking me to be less or more than I am, I feel something close to grace. I don't need a crowd. I don't need applause. I don't even need forgiveness. I need this. This stillness, this softness, this space. I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful.